Is Christianity a positive force for compassion in the world? That's our question today. It's a conversation on psychology, the brain, Christianity, and what makes us choose compassion over callousness. Professor Paul Gilbert is a clinical psychologist and leading global expert in the study and promotion of compassion. He's the founder of Compassion-Focused Therapy and the author of the book, The Compassionate Mind. Dr. Roger Bretherton is our other guest today, an academic psychologist, focusing research and practice on the positive qualities of character associated with well-being. He's chair of the British Association of Christians in Psychology and creator of the Character Course. I'll make sure there are links to both of my guests and their fascinating stuff from today's show, and we'll mention it at the end as well. But first of all, a very warm welcome to the show, Paul and Roger. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Justin.
It's great to have you both on with me. I'll start with yourself, Roger, because you were the one who suggested this show. You've been an unbelievable listener for some time, and it's been great to make your acquaintance in the last several months. Tell me, first of all, how did you end up in psychology yourself?
Yeah, so I think I've just naturally always been a very kind of curious person about other people. So just very, very interested in other people ever since I was a kid. And it meant sort of very naturally, even at the age of 14, I was one of those sort of precocious, irritating teenagers wandering around career fairs, asking about how to become a clinical psychologist. So I knew very, very early on that that's what I wanted to do. Psychology also sort of arrived in my life around about the same time that I got serious about Christianity as well. So that sense of vocation, the desire to do good in the world, to help people who were suffering, that was all part of it as well. And therefore, for me, those two things have always just come together and knitted together quite nicely. I've never felt a huge sense of tension between working as a clinical psychologist and being a Christian. And it was actually fairly early on in my career that I encountered Paul's work, actually. So I started working in the NHS. I was working with adults, largely in trauma and people who received diagnosis of personality disorder, depression, anxiety, etc. Paul had written a lovely little book on depression for my clients, and it sort of became one of my go-to books for them, really. And what I discovered is whenever they read this book by Paul, they would come back and say to me things like, "This guy is so kind, he's so lovely, I really feel that he cares for me," which I sort of interpreted as they probably prefer him to be their psychologist rather than me. Certainly that kind of idea of being a Christian and being a psychologist and compassion being central to all of it came to me very early on in my career.
Brilliant. Welcome along to the show, Paul, as well. Tell us how your journey into psychology happened.
Very strangely, actually. Very strangely. Originally, I was, this is in the 1970s, I went off and did my degree, but it was in economics, because in those days, psychology wasn't much of a profession and the money looked better in economics, to be honest. So I studied economics, but while I was doing my economics degree, I became more and more interested in psychology and became more and more wanting to work with people. And in those days, you could do things called changeover degrees, which I did at Sussex. So they would take people who didn't have a psychology first degree, and you could do an MSc in experimental psychology there. And to pay for it, partly to pay for it, I worked as a night psychiatric nursing assistant on the local acute unit. And so many kinds of people, mental health difficulties. And from that point of view, from there on, I decided I wanted to work as a clinical psychologist. So I went to Edinburgh and did a PhD, and the rest, as they say, is history. So that was my journey into psychology, really.
And how did the focus on compassion specifically begin for you?
Well, I'd had a number of interests. Some were to do with spirituality, which was, in my case, was more of a Buddhist orientation. But what was one of the turning points was that we use a therapy which is called cognitive behavior therapy. And what you do in this therapy is you explore the way depressed people are thinking. And usually your thinking sits with what you're experiencing. So if you're having problems with anxiety, then you're tending to have a lot of anxious thoughts. If you have depression, you tend to have a lot of depressing thoughts. And these can be things like, I'm a failure, I'm no good, life is pointless, life is worthless. And then you'd ask people to stand back and say, well, okay, so if you had a friend in your position, what would you say to them and how would you help them? And if you weren't depressed, how would you think about this? And so you get them to begin to change their perspective, right? And that can work quite well for some people, but it was also quite well known that you could have individuals who would be able to see alternative thoughts, but it didn't really help them feel better. So one day I asked this lady who had a very chronic depression, being suicidal and so on, how do you actually hear those thoughts in your mind? You know, when you think to yourself, oh, well, look, I feel like I'm a failure and unlovable, but actually I have a husband who cares about me. I have 3 lovely children and I've held down a good job. And, you know, some of this is to do with my background where I didn't feel lovable as a child, but now I am. How do you hear that in your mind, you know? And she was a little embarrassed at first. She said, well, as I hear them? And I said, yeah, as you hear them. She said, well, come on, you're doing cognitive therapy, aren't you? You got 3 lovely children, haven't you? You got a husband who loves you, haven't you? For goodness sake. I was quite shocked. I thought, oh my gosh, is that how you're hearing this in your mind, you know? Because we'd always been taught to focus on the evidence and try to get an alternative view. And so it turned out that people were not only saying negative things to themselves, but extremely in a very hostile way. So I simply said to her, well, what about if you was to create a very compassionate voice in your mind, you know, a part in that part of you that understood the awful things that happened to you as a child and the desire for you to heal and overcome your depression and everything, and you generate a kind tone to these thoughts. And she said, no, I'm not doing that. I've never been kind to myself. I don't want to do that. And so the next revelation was the discovery that actually when people started to be compassionate and kind to themselves, it actually opened up a whole range of unprocessed grief. So they'd suddenly find themselves in these terrible states of grief. Now, in those days, I was pretty naive because I thought, well, what's that about? But if you think about it, it's very much like, you know, if you like holidays and you go on holiday, you love holidays, you love thinking about holidays, then one day you go on a holiday and you're very badly beaten up and you end up in hospital. The next year you start thinking about holidays, you won't be looking forward to it. You'll have all these horrible feelings come back. So it's the same, that if when you're a child, instead of being cared for and loved, that didn't happen, when you start people on the compassion journey, rather than thinking, oh, this is great, actually what comes back is those traumatic experiences.
Right.
So compassion focused therapy really was that. It was the recognition that people often are quite hostile to themselves even when they're trying to be helpful. And secondly, that they can't use compassion because when they start to do it, it just opens up a whole lot of overwhelming, difficult experiences.
I'd love to begin, you know, obviously in the program to explore the neurological basis of that, the sort of evolutionary psychology behind it and so on. But returning to you, first of all, Roger, so how have these insights into compassion sort of dovetailed with what you're doing in terms of character and well-being and so on?
Yes, so in a sense, some of my journey was similar in the, so I was working in the National Health Service with people with diagnosed with personality disorders, and they're a very challenging group of people to work with. So in my case, I was largely working with people who were chronically suicidal or self-harming, and I was trained in an approach called dialectical behavior therapy, which belongs to this same sort of cluster of therapies called cognitive behavior therapy that Paul was talking about. And what I found was that my questions that I asked about the people I was working with started to change after a while. So instead of sort of going, what's wrong with this person and what should I do with them, I sort of started to ask more a question about what's missing here. In other words, what is it that their background, for whatever, didn't teach them, for whatever reason it was missing. So they didn't learn to self-soothe. They didn't learn to be kind to themselves. They lost the sense of safety and acceptance that allows them to make good decisions. And the moment you start asking those kind of questions, you are sort of, you're entering into the world of character strengths, which is how could people learn to be hopeful? How could gratitude help here? Where might some wisdom or some curiosity get into things? So in a sense, my approach is a bit more general than Paul's is, but it does very much include a cluster that some people will call strengths of humanity or virtues of humanity, which includes things like love, care, altruism, compassion, kindness. We can maybe get into how we define all these.
And as a Christian, you've obviously drawn on the biblical wisdom that you think sort of dovetails with this as well. In fact, this character course, we've just started using it in my house group and really enjoying it actually.
Sure.
But do you see a lot of overlap therefore between the insights from people like Paul and what you see in Scripture?
That's right. So there's three strands to what I do. So one is the empirical science. One is biblical study and theology. So I'm interested in that side of things. And then part of it is just really pragmatic in terms of what really works here, and when we do it and when we teach it to people, what really helps them and goes forward. And so, I mean, that's the fun of my job really, is dancing between the theology, the psychology, and then the sheer practice of what works in practice when we do it.
Before we delve into the science of it again a little bit, Paul, I'd just be interested if you're willing to share sort of where you find yourself, or maybe label yourself on the religious spectrum. Did I hear you say that you kind of have sympathies for a kind of Buddhist outlook, or do you see yourself more in a kind of atheistic kind of way of looking at the world?
No, I wouldn't call myself atheistic. I mean, I think the point is that, the great mystery that everybody doesn't really understand is consciousness. I mean, it's the great issue in Buddhism, it's the great issue in physics, it's the great issue. What is this thing we call consciousness? Is it a property of the universe? I mean, what is it? So I'm very interested in that. And interestingly, you may or may not know, but, at end of life now, people are sort of starting to use psychedelics for end of life fear. And one of the things that happens there is that people have these experiences which are could almost say they're religious, where people have a sense of connectedness. So this issue about when you engage with meditations or whatever, and you work in this idea of developing your sense of consciousness, one of the things that tends to emerge is this sense of connectedness to something greater than oneself. Now, whether or not you call that a God, whether you see that as a God creator, or whether you see that as how you see that would be up to you. But certainly, I wouldn't be called an atheist. What that is, what that consciousness is, what that sense of connectedness is, I have not the foggiest idea. But I certainly think that the universe is a lot more complicated than we can understand at the moment.
That's very interesting, and we've done a few shows with, I think, people who are somewhere on that spectrum, I think, of saying, no, I'm not willing to simply reduce it all to physical stuff.
No.
But obviously haven't gone the direction necessarily of Roger either. Let's talk about, the specifics then of this compassion focused therapy, and specifically I'd love a little bit of the theory, if you'll keep it at a layperson's level for my sake, on what are sometimes called the three systems: the compassion, the human brain, the evolutionary origins of compassion, and what you think the global implications of this are as well. And we'll just start to bat that around a little.
Okay, well, look, there are lots of different definitions of compassion. Okay, so one of the ways in which you can approach compassion is to look at its evolution, and there are two key things here. The first is called, what is the algorithm of compassion? Now, algorithm is simply an if A, do B. That's what it is. So if you think of your central heating, if the temperature goes too high, the heating goes off. If it goes too low, it comes on. How can it do that? It has what we call a temperature. Okay, so that's what is called a feature detector, and that allows it to change its activity. Now, your brain is basically composed of a lot of what we call algorithms, if A, do B. So, for example, if a lion, run, okay. If it's food, don't run, approach, salivate, and eat. If it's a sexual opportunity, don't do either of those things, do something called courting behavior. So, animals and humans, we have these wired in systems that if this happens, then do this. And that gets wired in. So what is the one for compassion? Well, the one for compassion begins many, many millions of years ago with caring for infants. So the parent, primarily the mother, if the infant is distressed, cries in a certain kind of way, then engage in behavior to address that infant's distress. So the basic algorithm is if signal of distress, hurt, or pain, then be motivated to do something about it to try to alleviate it. And many species do that with their infants. That's very clear. So caring behavior then is based upon this algorithm of if A, do B. Now you must have both of them, okay? Because there are some ideas of compassion that you only need the one, you only need to be sensitive, but not really. You need the response as well. So when you come to humans, the A is being sensitive to pain, which you can understand from an empathic point of view. So I can be sensitive to your emotional pain as well as your physical pain. But I also need the response. I also need to have the wisdom to know what to do to be helpful. And that wisdom is absolutely crucial to compassion, to know what would be helpful. So for example, if you're a firefighter, then what is helpful is making sure you've got your gear on and you know how to fight fires. And you don't require a calm mind or anything like that. You simply require a mind that is dedicated to save the person from burning. If you're working on a COVID ward, then you need the skills of medicine. If you're a counselor, then you need the skills of counseling. So compassion isn't just about intention. We can all have wonderful intentions, can't it? It's, are we prepared to acquire the wisdoms to be helpful? So those are the two key elements in compassion as we look at it. It's an algorithm which has a long evolutionary history. We know a little bit about how that works in the body, how we become sensitive to suffering and how we become motivated to do something to help. But we also know that we need both of these for a compassion.
And in that sense, I suppose we see this potentially in ways across the animal kingdom, but perhaps very specifically in the human case, in ways that have been developed because of our cognitive abilities, if you like, to know what is needed in a given situation.
Yes.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Maybe, I mean, the title we've selected for this conversation is Christianity a Positive Force for Compassion in the World? Perhaps, first of all, a brief word from you, Paul, and then we'll cross to Roger on where you see the positives and the negatives, if you like, of religion generally or Christianity in particular, as regards its ability to foster that kind of compassionate instinct.
Yeah, so I think you have to make a big distinctions between compassion as a religion, compassion as a psychology, compassion as ethics. So if I take a compassion as ethics, there's no doubt at all that Christian ethics is a phenomenally important force in the world, phenomenally important force in the world. I mean, it's based upon altruism, it's based on self-sacrifice, it's based on treating other people as your neighbor, it's based on, all of there's some wonderful ethical principles within Christianity, absolutely fantastic. The school of Christianity, however, is another matter. When it gets turned into a religion, then you have lots and lots of different schools. You have this sort of the creationists on the one hand, you have the hell believers in hell on another hand, then you have the David Jenkins and the Don Kuberts on the other hand. So there isn't really, when it comes to religion, any clarity about what Christianity is as a religion, because there are so many versions, and some of those versions are extremely harmful. I mean, we know that what the Christians did in the Spanish and the Portuguese did in South America in the name of Christianity, or what the Crusades did. So you can turn these religions into horrible things, really. But the basis of Christian ethics is absolutely fantastic.
Yes. So the theory good, but the practice very often wanting in that sense.
Yeah, when you turn it into religion, then you becomes a group,
sort of an
group and a tribe, and then you feel you can attack other tribes, and that is not a good idea.
Maybe some thoughts on that, Roger, and how you see Christianity as embodying or indeed sometimes not embodying this characteristic of compassion.
And I think, I mean, I very much recognize the picture that Paul paints there. And I think when you are a Christian, and if you like, you belong to that kind of club, it's even more distressing to you because you kind of feel implicated in some of those things that have happened in history and still go on now. And it's actually kind of a principal driver of my work, really, which is I think that from my point of view, what Christians haven't been that good at is actually kind of narrowing that gap between the theory and the practice, if you like, and kind of really thinking about, we have, for example, the wonderful teaching of the Sermon on the Mount, which is designed in a sense very much like psychologists would. It's kind of designed to try and create a different kind of humanity, a different kind of person. That seems to be what Jesus is saying there. And it seems to imply that if we live in that way, it will lead to not only our own flourishing, but the flourishing of the world in all kinds of different ways.
Could you mention exactly which phrases you're thinking of from the Sermon on the Mount there, Roger?
Yes, so I guess I'm thinking particularly once you get to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, at the beginning, it sort of ends with blessings and saying basically, if you live in this way, foundational to one of the areas I've researched, post-traumatic growth. It is the story at the end of the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, if you build your house on the rock of my words, in other words, the teaching that he's given, when the storm comes, you'll stand against. In other words, it really helps you in a good way. I also think very fundamental to the Sermon on the Mount is the idea of loving enemies. So I think Jesus subverts the traditional notion of a sort of heroic messianic figure, really, by saying this isn't about me coming and saving you against another tribe. The enemy in human life is actually evil itself, and that's what we need to stand against, which is why we have to, love our enemies. And then, of course, Jesus says things like, the way it's often translated in English is, you should be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. But I actually think a better translation of that is, you ought to be whole, you ought to be fulfilled, you ought to be complete. And so this idea of wanting to create human beings that really live, I think, the virtues of compassion in a really great way. And I mean, we can't exhaust it, can we, in this conversation, but it's all there. And so the difficulty for me, therefore, when I kind of look at the church through history and things like that, is being quite distressed by what we've got up to. And I guess the answer I've come to, as someone who is a psychologist and therefore tends to think about things quite empirically, is to look at the word fruit through the Bible, really, which is the idea that Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, it's by your fruits that you will know them. The Apostle Paul goes on to talk about these are the fruits of the Spirit, or the fruit of the Spirit, singular, and then starts labeling things like kindness, self-control, gentleness, etc. And so I guess I've sort of come to a view that says, it seems that what the Bible is saying is that we know if people are really, really following Jesus or not by the fruit that they exhibit, that's actually the sign. So even in science, for example, the definition, getting people to tick, yes, I'm a Christian, is a terrible variable, because it covers so many different things and all kinds of, and I have to say, psychologists have been distressed by that since the 1950s, really, since the first research on churches began, where they discovered that, for example, people saying, yes, I go to church, covered some of the worst people in the world in terms of cruelty and prejudice and things like that, and some of the most wonderfully saintly people in the world, and yet they all labeled themselves in the same way. So I very much recognize the picture that Paul has given. I think a lot about how we can deal with that.
Yeah, I suppose you do ultimately, though, believe that Christianity is a positive force for compassion in the world, obviously, when it's properly understood and lived in that sense, Roger.
Yes, so I think central to Christianity ultimately is being called to be with Jesus and to be like Jesus. So what we see evidenced in the Bible, in the Gospels, of Christ suffering and dying, giving of himself, asking us to love, I think all of that is crucial to what Christianity is. And I often think Kierkegaard had a lovely saying. He used to say that the fanatic, he was thinking of the two main commandments from Jesus, to love God and to love neighbor. And Kierkegaard said the fanatic is he who loves God but doesn't love his neighbor. It's like they've aced one commandment, or tried to, and then lost perspective on the second.
Evidently, Paul, Roger does see Christianity as an important component, an influence in creating more compassion in the world. Before we come to discussing that again specifically, I'd just be interested in where you see, if you like, the transformation coming from. Is it primarily through having people become more self-aware, through compassion-focused training and that kind of thing, to actually bring forth, if you like, what's there somewhere in their evolutionary psychology to the top, this compassion, and then we can perhaps talk about whether religion does or doesn't help in that way.
Yes, I think it's a great point, Justin. So again, I would just come back to this very clear distinction between the ethics of a religion versus the mechanics of a religion, about whether you believe that Jesus was the Son of God or whatever, or the Buddha or whoever it is you're talking about. So what are the ethical teachings? And I think the ethical teachings of Christianity are very much about, as Roger was saying, about sharing, about non-violence, about altruism, about human sacrifice, about putting other people before yourself. I mean, for example, the doctors and nurses working in the COVID world, risking their lives. That would be a classic example of a Christian principle. I mean, there'd be Buddhist principle as well, not just Christian, of course, but these basic ways of living to support other people, not just yourself. So that basic ethics, compassion ethic, runs through quite a lot of different religions. And I think from that point of view, it's very, very important. And the Christian one, I think, it stresses courage probably a lot more than the Buddhist one. So the courage aspect of Christian ethics, I think, is extremely important, as in, for example, Christ's preparedness to die at the most horrible of deaths. That's extraordinary. I mean, it's just extraordinary.
I was fascinated actually just listening to a lecture of yours the other day, Paul, where the example you drew on of just how callous humanity can be was indeed crucifixion, that for several hundred years, this was just part and parcel of the culture in Rome, this awful, torturous way of killing people. And it was just accepted. No one really batted an eyelid. That was the way things happened. And it just gives you a sense of how differently humans can respond given their cultural context to what is acceptable, or today most people in the Western world would shudder at the very idea. So in a sense, the point you made in that lecture was don't assume that the compassion you experience now is necessarily what would occur in another time and place and situation.
Yes, and I think the point about all of the religions, Christianity, is that you have to work for it.
Right.
The dark side, as you would call it evil, perhaps we just call it the dark side. The dark side is much easier to activate. But the point that you're making is a very, very important one, is that we can have cultures that really are just callous. I mean, the capacity for being sensitive to the pain that you're causing is simply turned off. I mean, I don't know if you know the story of the Vikings. The Vikings are very interesting because they actually did switch to a compassion. They did switch to Christianity, and that did change them. There's no doubt that Christianity has produced a massive change in ethical thinking in the Western world, for sure. It's the religion that's the problem. It's the identification. I'm this, you're that. It's
the tribalistic nature that sometimes
the tribalistic nature. Yeah. But the ethical principles to support others is terrific. So, and that again was a turning off even within the Roman Empire. I think it was probably the Christian ethics that began to say, hang on a minute, perhaps we shouldn't be Christian. Maybe the games is not a good idea.
Well, in a way, I'd be interested to hear Roger's response to that. We're going to have to go to a break first. But yeah, I think that draws us into some fascinating areas about the way the Christian story, in a sense, does have a crucifixion at the center of it, sort of maybe started to change the way people looked on the issue of callousness and kindness and compassion. Fascinating discussion for you today. Going to a quick break, but we'll be back with my guests, Professor Paul Gilbert and Dr. Roger Bretherton, talking about psychology, the brain, Christianity, and compassion on the show today.
What I want to invite Roger to comment on is, why couldn't the mental realm include an infinite consciousness?
It's too much like us. It's too much like putting it like the Greek views of the gods in some sense. They were too much like us.
They were finite and contingent. Here we're talking about a metaphysically necessary source.
I admire this noble aspiration to find the highest possible ideal. It's almost as if you're proposing a new religion to meet this new challenge.
It's not a new religion. Yes. What it is something that sits in the same place. It addresses some of the same needs, but it is not founded on the same principle.
If the New Testament says that Jesus did X, Y, and Z, did he do it or not?
I don't think it's a story that's made by committee. Am I going to have a later literary genius who comes up with a great story like this? Or am I going to say, no, Jesus is the genius, and somehow that story has basically been preserved?
Welcome back to the show today. Is Christianity a positive force for compassion in the world? We're asking. My guests are Professor Paul Gilbert and Dr. Roger Bretherton. I'll make sure there are links from both of them on today's edition of the show. You can find us via the podcast, via the YouTube channel, and of course broadcasting on Premier Christian Radio. I should say, for the sake of the watching audience on YouTube, I failed to mention it. I've got very short hair right now, and that's because I just did my lockdown head shave for charity over the weekend. So if you hardly recognize me, that's the reason. We're all in a sense in lockdown at the moment. And in a way, I felt in many ways that issues around mental health are even more acute, obviously, at this time, Roger. I'm sure you've been dispensing help and advice to people from your position. But coming back to the Christian way in which compassion, kindness, positive mental health can be a factor within a Christian worldview. I wondered what you thought of what Paul was saying in that last section in terms of, as he sees it, some of the positive ethical impact of Christianity, but also, again, highlighting the fact that there is this tribalism that is also part of what religion can bring as well.
Yeah. So I'm very interested in that sort of idea. And I think one of the psychology literatures that really helps us with it is an area that some people will call religious orientation, which is really the idea that you might call yourself a Christian, but there's lots of people calling themselves Christians that actually relate to their religion, their faith, in really, really quite radically different ways. It's one of the ways that some psychologists of religion have tried to get at, how do we understand the fact that very often in churches you will find some of the meanest people and some of the most wonderful people all in the same place. And it initially started off really with the idea that for some people their faith was a sort of explicit idea, really. There's kind of extrinsic notion, which it's like they kind of pick it up like a bag. It helps them, maybe it gets them to heaven, maybe it gains them some social status, but it's never much more than that in terms of they're sort of in their faith for what they can get out of it. And interestingly, when you look at that group of people, they tend to, some of them are among the meanest people you're ever likely to meet. They're sort of religious, but there isn't a lot of faith behind it. For other people, they have a sort of intrinsic kind of religion, which is sometimes viewed as a sort of, for them, their faith is a destination. So on one level, that they believe what they believe really clearly. But the danger of the kind of intrinsic approach is you do become quite tribalistic. So you sort of say, I belong to this group versus other groups. Some people have called them the true believers, you know, that they, for example, if you give them a questionnaire on whether they like to help people or not, tick, 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 you'll get all kinds of answers out of that. But if you actually put it to the test, you may find that they're hiding all kinds of prejudices and unwillingness to help and lack of compassion and things like that. And then more recently, other people came up with the idea of what they call quest religion. And quest religion, in a sense, if one is religion as a tool and the other is religion is a destination, quest faith, if you like, has the idea that religion is a journey. In other words, you have to be curious, you have to be open, you have to be wondering, that you can be deeply and profoundly committed to what you believe in, but you're also kind of keeping a curiosity and an openness beyond that. And interestingly, it's people who tend to score highly in that sort of quest index, really, who seem to be the ones who are least prejudiced, most likely to help people even outside of their group. There's all kinds of different social psychology experiments that have been done to try and explore this. But it's certainly one of the things I've been very keen to emphasize in the character course, which I know you're doing at the moment. It ends with the notion of curiosity. So it ends with this notion of seeking, looking beyond, wondering, this idea that both as human beings and as followers of Jesus, we're kind of unfinished. We are students. We're always learning, always trying to work it out. And I think that's the thing that keeps us open to other people, and it allows us to remain empathic to people who might not be in our group.
To what extent, you know, is Jesus in the ethical teachings, which obviously have formed the foundation in so many ways of various parts of Western society, essentially tapping into some of these psychological drives and principles that Paul has obviously been talking about in a more secular way that he sees as stemming from our evolutionary past and so on?
Well, I mean, if you take the Sermon on the Mount, for example, given that that's where we started, right at the core of the Sermon on the Mount, that the powerhouse of it all really is a series of spiritual practices. So whether it's giving secretly, not in order to gain external rewards, whether it's a life of prayer, and it seems like the idea of prayer that Jesus has is is both the Lord's Prayer, but also a private prayer, a secret prayer, where actually your prayers aren't about getting external kind of rewards for what you're doing. It's about actually really connecting with a sense of God. And then also the notion of fasting as well, which is a sort of, getting used to the idea that sometimes if we are to give ourselves away, we kind of have to learn to do without at times. And so I think there are a whole series of sort of spiritual practices in Christianity that I think if we follow them, many of them actually have quite strong parallels in psychology. So many of the practices, for example, that I study in psychology, whether it's gratitude, whether it's compassion, whether it's loving kindness, prayer of various kinds, are directly mirrored in Christian history as well. And the interesting thing about many of those practices, let's take loving kindness, for example, where if you were to do it in a prayerful Christian way, which is sometimes called the Ananias prayer, where you bless oneself, you bless your family and friends, you bless your acquaintances, you bless perhaps enemies or people you find difficult to get on with, that we know that when people do that, before you even try to answer the question whether prayer works above and beyond those kind of things, we do know that the kind of compassion and love that generates in us seems to ripple quite well through social networks. So before we even start asking, does a prayer work? Nevertheless, the fact that we have placed ourselves in that place of love, in intercession for other people, really has quite a positive effect on everything we come into contact with after that.
I imagine you agree with a lot of that, Paul. But in a sense, you may not necessarily have to see anything supernatural in seeing, obviously, the positive benefits of those ways of living in the world and practicing mindfulness and so on.
That's correct, Justin. So I think that we can explain that with good old physiology, that when people are kind to each other, it stimulates physiological systems within us, which has very powerful and important effects on our well-being. There's a part of the autonomic system called the vagus nerve, and when people are kind to you, that stimulates the vagus nerve. If they're horrible to you, critical of you, then it stimulates your threat system. See? So yes, I would have more down-to-earth explanations probably.
What's your approach to bringing out the most compassionate side of people, if you like? What would be the way in which you would encourage someone? Roger may say, I think there's some great wisdom to be had from the teachings of Jesus. Where would you point people to first and foremost to bring out that side? Yeah,
it's a great question. So the key issues, but why would people want to do it? So the first thing is trying to help people think, well, why would you want to be compassionate? What's in it for you, in a sense? And there's actually quite a lot in it for you, because when we become compassionate, our minds actually work in a way which is much more conducive to our well-being and our happiness, it turns out. Isn't that interesting? So first of all, helping people to practice compassion because they see the wisdom of it, they see the power of it, they see the importance of it, not because they feel they're following some principle or something like that, but they come to their own understanding about what compassion means, what it is, how it works in our minds, how if we are going to create a world that we all want to live in and have fun in and enjoy, then actually what we need to do is to be working together and take an interest in the well-being of each other. That seems to me like sensible, practical sort of stuff. I think the spirituality aspect of that is different, and then that comes from your meditations and getting one's mind around what is this consciousness, asking questions about, so, why am I here? What is this about? And what happens when I die? And because those are the questions that people are interested in, isn't it really? What happens when I go and so on. So I think that practically we can look to the physiological systems for why compassion is such a profoundly important thing. But when we come to the more spiritual dimensions, then we move into a more meditation. We begin to experience the nature of consciousness as interconnectedness. There's a slightly different positions, and sometimes even within the Buddhism, they get these two things confused. They're very different, actually, and they're actually rooted in quite different experiences. So the experiences I get from meditation, not quite the same experiences I get when I'm being compassionate to people.
Yeah. Interesting. Roger, I guess to what extent would you say that, in a sense, even the practices given by Jesus, the ethical teachings and so on, could simply be a product of, natural causes? We know that this works, and Jesus was a great exponent maybe of helping people to tap into those psychological truths.
Yeah. I mean, my feeling is that we don't really have to choose between those things. So you don't have to choose, does this have psychological impact, or does it, is it something spiritual that transcends that? My feeling is that almost every transcendental experience we have, or any moment where we feel a prayer has been answered, for example, very often we only know that because of our psychology. We get a sense of strengthening, there's cognitive process involved, there's emotional process involved. I do agree with Paul as well that generally speaking, when I'm trying to convince people, in the kind of world outside of church, where I do a lot of work with businesses and things like that, I very much sell the notion of compassion and other character qualities through the notion of them working. These things work for you, they do you good, they add to your well-being. In fact, when I first read one of Paul's books, I was so excited by it. I put together a program for businesses, and it was called The Compassionate Leader, and I tried to sell it to businesses. And I had a few arguments with managing directors about whether they needed to be kind and compassionate or not, and it just didn't sell. So I kept the program completely the same and just changed the title to Effective Leadership. It was all about compassion, all the same material, and suddenly it sold so I just reversed it. So this is what this will do for you. This is the story of my life. But I think from a Christian point of view, I think most Christians wouldn't want to say that they came to Jesus just because what they could get, that religion isn't, in a sense, you can say that's the function of faith. I've got no problem in that. That's one of the outcomes of it. But I think what most people would say, I think who came to Jesus would say they were attracted to him. They were attracted to him in some way, attracted to being like him in some way. And in the process of that faith, of meditation, of prayer, of fellowship, of different experiences, of reading scripture, etc., that they found that compassion began to occur in them, that was something they saw it in Jesus, it connected to them, and then it began to develop in them as they did it. So I think we don't necessarily view sort of being a Christian as a means to an end in that way. The other thing I would say as well is I think in Christianity we are posed with quite a bigger narrative as well, other than just what I do and what works. So I think when you read through the whole the whole gamut of scripture, the whole thing, you have this picture of sort of, it starts off in a garden with good fruit and bad fruit, and then it all goes wrong. And then it starts with a family who are there to bless the world. And the prophets come to that nation and eventually say, come on, produce the fruit. And then it sort of all fails with John the Baptist saying, you, as a nation, you haven't produced the qualities of character and the goodness you were supposed to produce. But here comes Jesus, and Jesus says, yes, but if you abide and dwell in me, you will produce that fruit. And then on to Paul the Apostle, who says, well, now with the Holy Spirit, that fruit will come out of you. And then this whole thing ends in a garden with a huge tree in the middle of it that has fruit and leaves for the healing of the nations. And so I think what Christianity adds to the picture really is this sense of a very, very big picture, hopeful meta-narrative that says, yes, you buy into this as an immediate practice, but it's actually also part of working out the world, part of transforming, or even, if you like, restoring the way the world is supposed to be.
And what I get from that, Roger, in a sense, is that you believe that compassion is kind of part of that bigger picture, that there is a sort of a purpose behind it all, that people are keying into something that exists outside of themselves, and that is God's kindness, love, compassion, and so on. From your perspective, Paul, I wonder, do you have hopes that the world will become inevitably a more compassionate place, or is it possible actually it might go in the opposite direction? We might fall prey to the worst side of ourselves, rather than necessarily going in the way that Roger believes it will ultimately prevail. That compassion, love, hope, through the Christian hope, the Christian vision will happen. Is that sort of not necessarily the case in a more secular, if you like, way of looking at compassion?
Well, it's a great question, because I think a lot is going to be how we deal with conflict, because conflict is the big issue. But compassion really needs to be for the dark side. How do we deal with our dark side? Humans have a terrible dark side, as you've been talking about, and conflicts are on the way. I mean, we've got people in various countries, let's say, who loves to stir up conflict. So there's going to be conflict coming with climate change, distribution of resources. We need to build up our health communities all over the world, because of this is one pandemic, but there are others on the way. So many things where actually, if we're going to solve the problems of the world, we have to work together. So the question is going to be whether we can see our politics and our businesses gradually moving towards creating the world that we all want to live in. So this means that whether you are in business or whether you are in politics, you have one motto, which is live to be helpful, not harmful. If everybody was to follow that one motto, if my business will be a business that will create things and that compete, but not be harmful. So then that takes out fossil fuels, that takes out tobacco, that takes out plastics, for example. So we actually start to create, if you want to call it a Christian ethic, you can call it a Christian ethics, the ethics to live to be helpful, not harmful. And that when we come to the crises of the world, and we've got a lot of them, be it healthcare, be it poverty, being social injustice, being all these things, we actually start to think about how can we live to be helpful? How can we address a lot of these issues in such a way that we resolve them, as opposed to I don't really care about you, I just want to make a lot of money.
It's so difficult, isn't it, though? Because even, when we started this lockdown, one of the first things that happened was the supermarket shelves were stripped bare of toilet roll, and and people went into that, I don't know, lizard part of their brain, which was it's all for it's self-survival, and so on. And so how do we engender this especially given that this pandemic is only going to make the resources potentially more scarce and more difficult? We're already seeing tensions between China and the USA and so on as people blame each other for this. So where do you begin, I suppose, with that ideal of asking people to consider others first?
I think it's a brilliant point, because look, the thing is that when people go rushing around buying up loads and loads of toilet rolls, remember, it's a minority. And your compassionate approach to this is that these are individuals who may not have had the greatest opportunities for developing emotional regulation. They may not be the people who deal with their fear very easily. They may be impulsive people, and they're okay, so we want to try but a lot of people didn't do that. And so the key issue is, yes, there'll always be people who do that because they're frightened, or they're impulsive, or they don't have good emotion regulation skills, or they're a little bit on the psychopathic spectrum, or for whatever reason. But what was interesting is that most people have not done that. What's interesting is that if you give them a context where they can be helpful, when they can agree to locking down to save others, they will do that. The majority, not everybody, but the majority will. And that's the key thing of, given that the majority will, how can we work with the majority of individuals who do want to see a more compassionate world? Most people do want to see a more compassionate world. And then the key issues that we have to then work with are the media and the politics, because those two together have got an unholy alliance, because a lot of the media are owned by the wealthiest people in the world, who it's in their interest to maintain social injustice, not to get rid of it. So we've got a lot of issues, I think, but this virus has lit up the idea that there is a potential in the right context for us to work together and pull together. We're not quite sure how to do it. We're not quite sure how to get our politicians to do it, but we want to do it.
Roger.
And I have to say, as someone who is also sort of teaching people to be compassionate and develop character in all kinds of different ways, at the same time that toilet rolls were being stripped from the shelves, I was also aware of who was leafleting the vulnerable people in their neighborhood to give them their phone numbers, which churches were doing, super calls on their food banks to make sure that they had enough resource to kind of reach people. I think about the kids in our neighborhood all drawing their rainbows and kind of making sure that the neighborhood had this sense of solidarity about it. So I definitely agree with Paul on all of those things, really. And then the other thing I would say as well, that as human beings, we do tend to have a pretty well-established negativity bias, which means that both we and the media will always tend, I think, for evolutionary purposes, towards looking at the negative, what's got wrong, what's a threat to us, what's difficult about things. So I'm quite often looking at some of the news websites that I look at, and usually you'll have 20 pretty damning articles about coronavirus and how terrible it is, and then maybe one sort of token article about some hope that's happened in some way. And that's because those are the, you know, if you didn't get bad news, you wouldn't feel you'd had the news, because we want to understand. A lot of my work, and this is very compatible with my view as a Christian, is about focusing on getting a really good, rich understanding of love, wisdom, caring, compassion, that actually, and it feels like pushing a rock up a hill because we're not naturally designed to think in those ways. But again, I mean, when you look biblically, there's the sort of Paul's famous letter to the Philippians where he talks about, you know, whatever's good, whatever's righteous, whatever's pure, whatever's holy, whatever's good, focus on that, look at that. And then we don't often go to the next verse where he effectively says, as you've seen these things in me, practice them. So he's saying, I've kind of modeled these things for you in your presence. Try and develop them too. So I guess one of the ways I would view developing compassion and developing goodness generally in the world is modeling ourselves on others that we see that in. So rather than looking at the sort of negative input we often receive through various forms of media, who do you know who's wise? Who do you know who's good? Who do you know who is gentle and compassionate and kind? And learn from those. And very often I find it's in the church community that's where I found those exemplars.
That's an interesting point, though, because I do wonder whether we're sort of fighting against something in that sense, the way that social media now dominates so many things, and it can unfortunately tend to bring out the good sometimes, but also the worst. You know, it's those scaremongering articles that often get shared. It can inevitably lead to that tribalistic ways of thinking as people go into their political silos or religious silos. And equally, you know, that there's the sort of the keeping up with the Joneses, sort of the Instagram stuff, where it can engender a way of I'm not as good as that person, and so on. So part of me, I suppose the pessimistic side of me, Paul, wonders whether compassion is, well, it's not easy to foster necessarily, is it? Because we have a lot of other drives within us that seem to militate against it. And often our technology, as good as it can be, sometimes only serves to provoke the greed and the envy and all those other parts of, you know, that are other drives within us as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean, we are the most caring and sharing of all species. Absolutely. And part of the reason for that is because we spent, you know, 1 million years or however long it was as hunter-gatherers. Now, hunter-gatherers had to care and share because their survival depended on it. They were always in crisis of finding enough food or child mortality or defending against predators. So when we are needing to, we can care and share fantastically. What happened was we found agriculture. Agriculture suddenly took away the crisis because now we had enough food. In fact, we had loads of food, and we built bigger groups. Then we had dominant males. Aggressive males started to get to the top and control resources. Then those groups became empires, all with dominant aggressive males who created these horrible hierarchies where the people at the top had lots, the have-lots, have-nots, and have-nones, you know. And we haven't really got free of that. So we've created an environment where there's huge amounts of resources and the grabbers grab it and all the rest of the people kind of struggle around a little bit at the bottom. We haven't really created the social context which provide opportunities for us to generally care and share with each other. And so we do need a politics which are actually going to start to think about, rather than having a politics that supports this competitive Thatcheristic, you know, there's no such thing as society, just individuals competing with each other. That psychology has to go. It's absolutely dead in the water. Okay. And if we can get people to understand that we need to have a politics and we need to have a media that's focusing on how do you foster caring and sharing between individuals, between countries, between communities, this is the we want. Competitiveness really has had its day. Unregulated competitiveness has had its day.
How I suppose my next question is how do you foster that? You know, we know that human beings can be incredibly callous, as we were saying, you know, the Roman Empire and so on, perhaps the preeminent example of that. How do we foster a change of heart in that sense?
Well, I think that's a brilliant point because I think that's a brilliant point because the first thing is, do we want to? And I think we do. So the next question is the how-tos. And then to be aware, there is no solution on the shelf waiting for us to pick it off. We have to do exactly what you suggest. We have to work it out. We don't actually know at the moment. But if you think about after the war, right? after the war, there was a real determination to build a better society. So within 15 years, we'd built a health service, we built an education service, we built a trade service that actually worked. Within 15 years, we had no money. We just come out of a war in terrible debt. But the will was there, the determination was there, and we did it. So I have no doubt at all we can do it if the determination is there. But how we do it, we're going to have to work that out, because there's no solution sitting on the shelf about how do you create a caring, sharing species to become a caring and sharing when actually you've got lots of resources. Because caring and sharing was primarily when you had crises. That's what brought us together. Now, when you don't have a crisis, how can you be caring and sharing? So it's a brilliant question, because it's where our psychologists and our sociologists and our political thinkers need to go. We need to work it out. It's never been done before. Humans have never done this. They've never created caring and sharing societies when there is so much resources around. We don't know how to do that. So I think that's extremely exciting. And a lot of it depends upon refereeing and bringing in regulations and all that sort of stuff. That'll be part of it. But it's a great challenge. But if we want to, I think we can. Okay. But we don't know how to quite yet.
Roger, what's your solution to how we do the things that you obviously both agree on we need in our culture and society?
So I guess my view is that really ultimately, and I kind of hear the irony in me saying this at the same time, is that the church should be that community. So the aim of the church really is to be a utopian community that makes goodness possible. Now, that's the idea, that it kind of shapes it together with other people and should be fairly resilient to many of those kind of influences in our society. Now, as you know, with lockdown and all that kind of thing going on, churches are really sort of meeting online and all kinds of unusual things going on. And the conversation I'm listening to really, really closely in the church now is what will this look like next? And I know, Justin, I've shared with you previously some of the research I've been doing with an evolutionary psychologist called Robin Dunbar. And he has this idea that really as human beings, we are designed, our kind of upper limit of meaningful relationships is about 150 people, that we can't really work much beyond that. And I've looked through a lot of the church planting literature and church growth literature and really found that actually this number of 150 comes up over and over and over and over again as a meaningful human community where you don't have to have subgroups competing against one another. It can be open to external sources as well, but nevertheless you have a sense of belonging and a meaningful connection to it. And interestingly, as I'm listening to some of the conversations that are going on in churches around the UK at the moment, it does seem to me that people seem to be going, maybe we don't need to be as big and successful as we have been so far. You know, maybe we don't need to pack thousands of people into a room. Maybe actually there's something about the kind of connectedness we've achieved online that really works. And
I
really,
don't know which 1,000 number churches you've been to in the UK, Roger, but I'm not aware of that many. Though I do appreciate, I think this whole situation presents a challenge to that kind of mega church culture, certainly in the US and elsewhere. And I think that's always been the struggle in those sorts of church environments. How do you create community in what is effectively really a very large gathering? But your view is that the church could be, in principle, the beginnings of seeing those kind of compassionate communities develop that are not so swayed in that sense by the natural impulses to fear, greed, and anything else that the politicians and the others might use as a way of sort of getting their way, as so often happens.
And I realise it's a bit of an idealistic view, but I think that's what it's meant to be as we gather around Jesus. That's what we are supposed to learn, and it's one of the reasons why the New Testament, particularly in Paul's epistles, is full of him really just going on about how people aren't really living up to what they're supposed to be, because he's kind of like, this is a community that really should be living like Jesus.
Well, and inevitably, as you all read in those letters, very broken, human, frail kind of community, but one where you do see amazing things happen as well, alongside all the humanity involved. We're going to go to our final break and be fascinated to just get some final thoughts from both yourself, Roger, and Paul, as we continue this conversation on compassion, Christianity, and whether it's a positive force for compassion in the world. You're listening to Unbelievable.
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Brierley on Premier Christian Radio and enjoy the conversations between Christians and skeptics, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content and much more, download the Premier Unbelievable app today.
Is Christianity a positive force for compassion in the world? We've been asking on the show today. My guests have been Professor Paul Gilbert and Dr. Roger Bretherton. Find out more about Paul at compassionatemind.co.uk. Paul is a leading global expert in the study and promotion of compassion, founder of Compassion Focused Therapy. Dr. Roger Bretherton, you can find out more about his character course at thecharactercourse.com. I'll make sure there are links to both of them from today's show as well. And Paul, just in that last section, Roger was saying it's an idealistic way of looking at it, but the idea is in Christianity that the church embodies this kind of caring, compassionate community, which isn't necessarily susceptible to the vagaries of what the politicians and the wider world throw at people. Your concern, I suppose, is that it very often doesn't live up to that in practice, and perhaps you'd like to comment on that.
Well, I think the point is that we come back to the issue about a Christian ethic as opposed to a Christian group, because what we know is that the right-wing Christian groups in America have driven some of the most awful policies to, get rid of the Obama Medicare and all of the stuff. So right-wing Christians in America tend to drive some pretty hostile views towards dealing with poverty and injustice and so on and so on. So we have to be slightly cautious that Christianity will kind of do it for us, because I'm not so sure. It all depends upon our understanding of compassion, and whether or not we're a Christian or not is actually having a real sense of driving towards social justice, driving towards building communities that share and care together, be it on our science, be it on our developing a vaccine, be it on our terms of trade, whatever it is, that we actually do move towards a world that actually addresses some of the terrible injustices of the world. Now, that could be rooted in Christian ethics, but not necessarily. I mean, I'm very much involved with a group called Christian Compassion in Politics, and what they've tried to do is to pass a bill where you can't have legislation that knowingly harms sections of a community that are least able to defend themselves. So, for example, the United Nations have been very hostile to David Cameron's and Osborne's austerity. They were very critical of that because they said it was callous politics. So we don't want callous politics. We want compassionate politics where we don't pass legislation that causes damage to people, and we do pass legislation which actually moves us towards more equality. So those two principles, I think we can work towards, whether or not you're a Christian or not. If you are a Christian, then you should, I would hope, support those two basic ideas within the Compassionate Politics group.
What about you, Roger? I mean, in a way, so often these arguments then boil down to, well, it's in the eye of the beholder what the best policy is for the ultimate well-being of the world, and right and left-wing sort of policies and so on. But is there, what would you agree with, or what would you question in?
I mean, let's go with the first bit of Paul's comment then, in terms of what we might call the right-wing Christians in the United States, which I think is from my point of view, that's quite close to home in terms of I know many people who would hold those views. And also I really struggle to kind of fully understand them. And my temptation actually is to reject them. And I guess I've been sat in I guess the question I've sat in for a while now is what do I do with my compassion when I encounter somebody else's fundamentalism? So when I encounter an opinion that I don't agree with and seems harmful, and I don't seem to be able to change it, what do I do then? And my answer actually, and I felt I was sort of challenged by God, it was sort of quite a spiritual process, was to sit down and listen and say, I don't get this, and I don't understand what you're talking about, and I cannot see how this connects to Jesus, and I need you to help me to understand it. And as I've had some of those conversations, sometimes I've felt they're fruitful, so I felt they go nowhere. But I am aware of kind of multiple sort of groups around the world that are trying to put those people together. So I think about one of the projects that the Rose Castle Foundation up in Cumbria did, I think it was last year, where they put Republicans and Democrats, I think for one of the main universities, either Princeton or Stanford, neither of those universities will thank me if I've got them wrong, in the same room, talking to one another, trying to understand, trying to listen. And it seems to me that it's that kind of dialogical kind of understanding of one another that I see the hope in, and then where that could go. Part of what's going on politically, I think, as well, is that opposition parties, both here and in the States, have increasingly started to see the other side not just as a disagreement, but as evil and wrong. I know in the States that over the last couple of decades, there's been a tendency for people from different parties not to socialize together and to separate themselves from one another. And sometimes what's happened is Christianity has ended up sort of, being vocal on one side of that dilemma, whereas my experience of the church, at least, is that in the church, I've met people from every possible political persuasion, every demographic. And therefore that has, for me, been a place that actually bit by bit has sort of softened my political views, really, and helped me to see what other people are trying to get at.
Fantastic. What for you does the future look like, Paul, as we start to wrap today's show up? Do you feel positive, hopeful? I guess especially in this current moment we're living in.
Yes.
When it comes
I feel incredibly hopeful. I mean, it's very hopeful because, I mean, if you think about, it's much better now to be, I don't know, homosexual or black or a woman than it was, say, 300 years ago. I mean, actually, we've made huge progresses. We've got a hell of a lot to do. We've taken a lot of steps backwards. But, if you think about what our lives are like now compared to 100 years ago or 1,000 years, if you would like to go and live in the Roman era, then good luck to you. I certainly wouldn't. But so we've made, or the Vikings or whoever. So we have made a lot of progress, but a huge amount to do. And I think one of the things that I would argue for all of us, whether we're Christian or whoever we are, is the sense of accountability at the end of your life. So I often say to religious people, look, I'd like you to imagine that, you've died and you've gone to heaven and there's Jesus in front of you. And Jesus says to you, okay, look, I see from the list here, you voted against helping immigrants. Could you explain that decision to me? You voted against tax to increase social justice. Could you just explain that to me, really? Before you come in, could you just tell me so accountability for me is absolutely crucial. Whether you're a Christian or whether you're not a Christian, how do you account for your moral behavior? In other words, we do need to be aware of what is the ethical principles we are living by. And if we say we're living by Christian principles, I personally like Christian ethics, then let's make sure that we are, and let's be accountable to that ethical process.
What would you make of that parable from Paul of Jesus at the pearly gates, giving people a questionnaire before they come through?
I mean, interestingly, I agree with that in many respects. So I guess the way I think about it is I think we all live in the face of death. So we all live in the fact that our lives will come to an end at some point. On one hand, that's an energizer. We want to get things done. There's lots of things we might like to achieve or do in the world before that moment. But then the other side of it is I think that for that to be a meaningful belief, we also have to live with a sense of submission, a sense that says at some point, almost like my students who've just submitted their essays last month, we submit our lives to God. And I live with a perpetual sense of that whatever I do with my life, however things go, at some point I sort of, in my view anyway, kneel before Jesus. I know him to be gracious, I know him to be forgiving, but I also know that I kind of kneel with, this is what I tried to do and this is what I tried to accomplish, and with a sense of hope. And as Paul says, a sense of accountability, a sense of did you do well with what you were given, is the question I think will be asked.
I'm pretty sure Jesus told a parable along those lines himself. Yeah, great to have the conversation today on compassion. Now, if you want to find out more, there are some great resources here. I can absolutely recommend the character course from Dr. Roger Bretherton, one of our guests on today's show, and Professor Paul Gilbert. You can find out more about compassionatemind.co.uk for the website about all of his work in the area of compassion. And I'll make sure there are links from today's show as well. But Paul and Roger, thank you very much for being with me on today's show.
Thank you, Justin.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.